My original idea for this video was to rank every single spell and sorcery, but my gosh, there are so many. Ain't nobody got time for that. So I decided to rank all the 13 different sorcery schools, and we'll go from there and talk about each spell individually if there are ones to call out. So let's go. In any video ranking anything really, there is some subjectivity, so be sure to let me know in the comments down below what you would do differently with this list, and we can discuss it there.
Yeah. Great.
We'll start off with the D rank, and essentially everything in this list is more or less unusable. We'll start out with the Spells Sorceries. Now, this is a pretty rare sorcery school that most people probably haven't even heard of. I'd be really interested to know if you guys have seen these spells. There are only two spells in this, Great Oracular Bubble and Oracle Bubbles. Now, both of these spells are relatively useless. I mean, they do require intelligence and arcane to cast, which is very uncommon for any kind of spell, so it's not really commonly used, and they both have really slow wind-up animations. Neither of them do tons of damage. You just kind of like poof out some bubbles and do some damage kind of with them. But anyway, we can move on. Aberrant Sorceries are next. Now, the Aberrant Sorceries, there is also two, the Briars of Punishment and the Briars of Sin, and you can actually buff these with the Staff of Guilty if you do have that as well. Now, with both of these spells, they have a relatively slow wind-up time, and they do take HP as well as FP, and a common thing with spells like these, especially melee kind of spells like the Punishment spell, is that you can take damage when you're casting them, and you don't want to take damage while casting it, so you lose a chunk of health from the spell cast as well as from actually taking damage, so they can be hard to get off, and then on top of getting them off, you're going to lose health from taking the damage from getting hit as well as just from using the spell. So they have a lot of negatives to them. They are interesting though, because they're very unique kind of spells that you can use, but in my opinion, there are just so many better options on this list. Next is the Full Moon Sorceries, and these are very high level, like end game spells. Rani's Dark Moon and Renala's Full Moon, they're essentially the same animation. The moon just looks slightly different, and one of them does cold damage and one just does straight magic damage. Both of these have a slightly faster wind-up time than they used to. They actually did buff these in the last patch. You could get away with using one of these to start a boss fight, and Renala's Full Moon does reduce the enemy's magic damage negation, so they will take more damage from spells. So there is some benefits to it, but ultimately there isn't a huge amount of time to get these off in fights, and you may use them in some of these slower moving boss fights, but realistically there's just better options anywhere else. You can buff these spells via the Carrion Regal Scepter as well, which is one of the best scepters in the game, so they get a couple of extra points for that. But we'll move on to C rank. These are the average spells. Some of these spells are really good, some of them are really bad, but they're all very interesting. We'll start out with the Magma Sorceries. The Magma Sorceries, you can buff these with the Gilma Glintstone Staff, which you get from the Volcano Manor, and these require intelligence and faith to cast, and some of the benefits of these spells is that they're very unique for an intelligence build because they do fire damage. They're some of the only ones that do something other than magic or cult. Now, most of these spells like Magma Shot, Rolling Magma, and Gilma's Fury are relatively usable. Not great, but usable, and Rykard's Rancor is one that I've really struggled with. Some people say it's really good, some people say it's really bad, and I'm kind of in the middle. I think it is really good when you get the effect around an enemy. You can kind of like loop the moving red energy like around an enemy and hit them with all of the different explosions, and it does do a lot of damage, but for the most part it's very hard to aim. I think that there is a benefit. You could definitely make some kind of magma build using one of these spells, like Magma Shot I think is one of the better spells in this line. Rolling Magma's not bad either, but ultimately there's nothing special about these spells. They're just relatively average. The Crystalline Sorceries are next. These can be buffed with the Crystal Staff or the Rotten Crystal Staff. There's only three of these, being Crystal Release, Crystal Torrent, and the Shattering Crystal. Shattering Crystal and the Crystal Release both are relatively ineffective in most situations. There isn't really a good time to get these spells off, and they don't do enough damage to really worry about having to use them in those scenarios. The Crystal Torrent, however, is actually more or less worth using in a lot of scenarios, especially when you combine it with things that buff your magic damage. You can just stand there and spam this attack out, kind of like the Comet Azure, which you see people use. They use this tons to just stand still and just spam the attack out. You can do this with the Crystal Torrent as well. It does slightly less damage than Comet Azure, but it has a very similar effect, and that's why this makes it into C rank. If it didn't have this spell, it would absolutely be a D rank set because the other spells are relatively unusable. It's just the one standout for the Crystalline Sorceries. Death Sorceries are next, and these can be buffed with the Prince of Death Staff to boost all of their sorcery damages. These also require intelligence and faith in order to cast. These spells include Ancient Death, Rancor, Explosive Ghost Flame, Fear's Mist, Rancor, Call, and Tibia's Summons. Some of these spells are practically unusable. Fear's Mist, for example, I honestly have never seen anyone get hit with the Death Blight effect by actually using this spell. I'm not exactly sure why, or maybe I'm just not using it properly, but it should function the same as the other mist spells, which we'll talk about when we get into some of the other mist spells, but it just doesn't work. Like, I honestly have never been able to get it work. If you you've figured out a way to actually deathblight an enemy, do let me know in the comments. Rancor Call is a usable spell. It will automatically target enemies when you cast it. The Ancient Death Rancor is like the upgraded version of it, which I think is an absolutely fantastic spell to use because enemies will often dodge when you cast spells, and when you cast a spell, they'll dodge. The dodge will have ended before the spell actually gets to them because it takes so long, and it does do heaps of damage. So if you have enemies that are really large, you can deal lots of damage with this attack. And Tibia's summons, relatively average, wouldn't really use it in any situation, and ultimately the set is okay. And I think the Ancient Death Rancor is one of the real standouts here, and it just has some unique effects to a lot of the different spells. So that's why it is in a C rank. It's time for the B rank, and we're going to start off with the Night Sorceries. These can be buffed with the Staff of Lost. They can boost the Night Shard and the Night Comet. Now, these are really interesting, and there's one key aspect that makes this a B rank sorcery school compared to some of the others, and that is because the Night Comet and Night Shard, as well as Ambush Shard technically, will not trigger the enemy to dodge. So like we were talking about with some of the spells of the death, and as well as a lot of spells, if you are like a mage, you'll know that there are enemies that essentially just input watch. So as soon as you cast something, they will just automatically dodge and avoid it. Now, the benefit with these spells is because they're technically invisible, semi-unseen, what have you, they won't actually dodge them. So you can hit them 100% of the time as long as they're not already in the middle of some animation or just moving out of the way. They will never actually actively dodge this kinds of spells coming towards them. There's some other interesting things here like Eternal Darkness, which will absorb any magic spells that go near it. It'll just like absorb it into this like gravity hole thing. And Unseen Blade and Unseen Form. Unseen Form makes you invisible, and Unseen Blade makes your weapon invisible. So there's a lot of interesting things in this set, and I think there's some benefits and some positives and negatives to it. And I absolutely would have Night Comet in a lot of builds because it's just a easy spammable attack that you can spam on enemies that won't dodge. So there's absolutely some benefits to using the Night Sorceries. Next is the Primeval Sorceries, and there's only 3 of these, and there is no staff that buffs them all, but it's Comet Azure, the Founding Rain of Stars, and the Stars of Ruin. Now, the main one here is Comet Azure. It's the most highly used. It's a huge damage spell that will tear through enemies like you wouldn't believe. It just melts them as long as they stand in its area. Founding Rain of Stars is relatively unusable in most scenarios because it just creates a downpour of star rain in one specific area. Most enemies just move away from it, and in a mage build, you're going to be moving around a lot anyway, kiting enemies, unless you're just going to stand there and take damage from them, which you probably aren't going to do. Stars of Ruin is usable, and I could see it fitting into some builds, and it does do a decent amount of damage when you do hit enemies with it, but there's just some better options for spammable spells that it's kind of what Stars of Ruin is acting like. It's just a spammable that will deal a decent amount of damage, and there are better spammable options, but Comet Azure is the massive standout here, and that's why it's in B rank. Cold Sorceries. There are no staff here for the Cold Sorceries. There is the Snow Witch hat, however, which does buff the Cold Sorceries. These are Jeweler's Moonblade, Freezing Mist, the Frozen Armament, Glintstone Ice Crag, and Zamoa Ice Storm. Most of these are relatively average. The 2 standouts here is the Glintstone Ice Crag, which is essentially like Glintstone Pebble or those kind of spammable spells with a slightly less range, but it does do ice damage as well, or cold damage as well, so you will get benefits from that, and it will build up the Frostbite meter. And Anjula's Moonblade is the absolute standout, and I almost considered putting this in A rank just because of Anjula's Moonblade and how valuable it is as a spell. I talk about this spell in depth in my endgame spells video, so go watch that if you want a full breakdown of why the spell is so good. But essentially it is the Carrion Greatsword except with a Frostbite effect on it, plus a Frostbite wave after the blade hit, so you can hit enemies twice, and it's just a fantastic spell that builds up Frostbite, which is a really great status effect in Elden Ring. A rank is next, and we're going to start with the Gravity Sorceries. These are buffed by the Meteorite Staff, which will boost all of these different spells. A cool thing about the Gravity spells as well is that they do physical damage rather than magic or cold, or even the ones that do fire damage, so they're really unique in that way, and they get some extra points because of that. These spells are Collapsing Stars, Gravity Well, Meteorite, Meteorite of Astel, and Rocksling. Key standouts in this list is absolutely Rocksling. For one, it's one of the best spells to have during the mid-game to end-game because of the physical damage it does. It's a great different spell to have in your arsenal when enemies do have high magic resistance. It also does heaps of stagger damage, so you can stagger enemies very quickly with it. It was one of the key spells I used in my sorcery build throughout most of my playthrough. Meteorite of Astel is also pretty valuable, especially on big enemies, because you can hit them all with all the different meteors that come down. It does tons of damage in that regard, and the others are just relatively solid. I wouldn't say they're great standouts, and they probably don't fit in most builds, but Collapsing Stars is pretty solid. Meteorite I wouldn't really use, and Gravity Well is just okay in terms of standards. But this is why it fits into A rank, because of these two benefits of the Rock Sling and Meteorite of Asta. Carrion Sorceries are next, and this one I really struggled whether it should be S rank or A rank, so I'm very interested to know what you guys think. Before we talk about why, we'll break down the sorceries in general. Now, these are buffed by the Carrion Glintstone staffs. There's a couple of them that either buff the Carrion sword based ones like Carrion Slicer, or the ones that buff the other spells in this line. Now, these are all of the Carrion Great Swords, Phalanx, Piercer, Retaliation, Slicer, Glint Blade, Phalanx, Great Blade, Phalanx, Lucidity, and the Magic Downpour and Magic Glint Blade as well. There's plenty of spells in this list and plenty of really solid usable spells. Carrion Greatsword is fantastic until you get Anjula's Moonblade. You'll absolutely use that. The Carrion Slicer is a great spell if you're making like an enchanted knight build and you're not using a sword. You can just slice enemies with that. Great Blade Phalanx, and all the Phalanxes in general, but Great Blade Phalanx is the major standout because of the huge amount of stagger damage it does, so you can break enemy stances very quickly with it. Lucidity is just it removes sleep and madness, some of the lower two status effects that you'll ever really see in Elden Ring, so it's not really usable. Magic Downpour, again, not very usable, and Magic Glint Blade is okay. It's a decent spell at the very start of the game, but it gets quickly outpaced by a lot of other spells. So realistically, there are some huge standouts in this set, like the Carrion Greatsword, but it does get outclassed by Anjula's Moonblade. You've also got Carrion Slicer, which is fantastic all the way through, and then Great Blade Phalanx, which is also fantastic all the way through the game. Now, because the only really two standouts in this list, while the rest are relatively average to possibly slightly above average, that's why I ended up with going into the A rather than into the S rank because of that, and some of these spells are outclassed by different alternatives, so that's why we ended up there. Whew, here we go. It's time for S rank.
Finally!
First, we have Loretta's Sorceries. There are two spells that are unique to Loretta, which have their own sorcery class, and this is the Loretta's Great Bow and Loretta's Mastery. Both of these spells are fantastic and don't really have a partner to compare outside of these schools. Loretta's Great Bow is probably the most accurate and best long-range spell that you can use as a sorcerer, and Loretta's Mastery is an extension of that fires 4 Great Arrows rather than 1. While the 4 Great Arrow version doesn't necessarily hit as accurately as the range one or with as much damage, because some of the different arrows can miss because of the way that they come out of the magic bow itself. But Great Bow is fantastic and Mastery is also great. So both of these fit into S rank, and they fit in almost every single sorcery build because you're going to want to have a long range option in most scenarios just to pick off enemies from range. They just aren't really outclassed by anything else for what their purpose is, so that's why they fit into S rank. And the last on this list, the top of this list, is the Glintstone Sorceries. Now, as you would expect, considering Glintstone is such a key part of the game, that's probably why it is the best, but there are so many spells in this list, and we're not going to go through all of them. We'll just go through some of these standouts. This is like the catch-all for anything that doesn't fit within all of the other categories. Now, the main things in here that you'll get is like Glintstone Pebble, Glintstone Comet Shard, the Great Glintstone Shard. These are all of your spammable spells that you'll use heaps throughout your playthrough. If you're starting out as an astrologer, you start out with Glintstone Pebble. Eventually, you'll upgrade to Great Glintstone Shard just as a cheap, high-damage spammable spell. You've also got Comet, which goes through enemies, and same as Night Comet as well. I'm not sure I mentioned that before, but Night Comet and Comet will go through enemies and both deal decent, solid amounts of damage. You've also got some different spells that aren't really matched by anything others, like the Glintstone Arc, which is like an AoE in front of you. You've got the Rock Blaster, as well as the Shatter Earth spells, which deal AoE damage to you around you. You've also got the great spell, Terra Magica, which increases your overall magic damage done, so you could fit this into every magic build, just stand inside that circle and increase your damage that you're doing. There is just a huge amount of benefits to all of the different Glintstone sorceries that you can get, and realistically, if you just use Glintstone sorceries throughout your playthrough, you would have so much flexibility because of the melee options you have, the good range options you have, the different buffs that you can put on weapons like Scholar's Armament or Scholar's Shield, the different Shatter Earths. You can also increase the light around you with Starlight, which I actually really like. There's plenty of options here. There's just so much value in the Glintstone sorceries, and that's why it's the top one on our list. Let me know your favorite spells in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.